Hi, everybody. Nice to see familiar faces, as well as a few people that I haven't met before. And I just want to check with the audio people first. Seems like my voice is a little bit louder than Chet's, so please adjust it accordingly. Anyway, so today we're going to talk about a very practical topic. I think it's practical. It's practical for all of us who are human, and it's practical for all of us who are aspiring to progress and grow on a spiritual path. And so that's my intent for today, is to have very practical and hopefully interesting and fun, actually fun talk. That's what I intend for today. So, so the topic, as Ted mentioned, is perfection versus perfectionism. And each of us has a variety of different characteristics as who we think we are as individual people. And some of these characteristics might be intrinsic, and others we maybe have just grown into and adapted to and adopted over time because of our social environments. And these various personality traits, as well as habits and tendencies to behave in certain ways, potentially can either help us or hurt us in daily life. The characteristics themselves may actually be neutral, but it's our selfish and our self-centered clinging to them that surely can be an obstacle. These personal characteristics associated with the ego stand in stark contrast to the absolute, the state of pure consciousness, the state of perfection. As long as we feel that we're separate, there are efforts we can make to encourage the possibility of experiencing oneness. Until the goal is reached, we perceive our separateness. We think of ourselves as our superficial, unique qualities, or what we think of as uniqueness. But there are times when we might get the sense of the current that underlies everything, the peace that's within us, the self that pervades everything. For example, when we have a truly clear-minded moment, when we forget ourselves in the act of serving others, when we experience the beauty and awe of nature, when we have the experience of deep peace and meditation, we might get just a glimpse of this absolute, as much as we're capable of comprehending it. It may be a very clouded glimpse, but still it gives us knowledge about why it's important to keep moving forward. And we really don't want our selfish traits and tendencies to be an impediment to our peace and well-being, let alone self-realization. So then the broad question is, how can we best manage our individualities so that we can go beyond them? So in today's talk, first we're going to delve a little deeper into understanding the connection between our individuality and our efforts to achieve the goal of liberation, or oneness, or transcendence, or self-realization, whatever you'd like to call it, and as well as how to think about overcoming the obstacles that each of us has in reaching this ultimate goal. Then second, we'll take some time to discuss how this goal can be labeled as perfection in the truest sense. Third, we'll discuss one particular obstacle, which is perfectionism. And a good question, of course, is why perfectionism and why not some other trait or characteristic? And we'll address that too. And next, we'll talk about the importance of adaptability in our personal traits and some ways in which apparent obstacles related to our individuality can be overcome. And along the way, we'll consult with some of the great teachers using their words and examples to guide us. So first, and you all can just maybe think about this in your own mind as we're talking, what are our individual traits and tendencies, and why should we pay attention to them? This collection of personal traits and tendencies that we have is a source of our human personhood. And certainly, all the great saints and sages have had their unique personalities. And they all have personalities that distinguish them from other people. Just because someone's a saint doesn't mean they don't have a personality, right? So have you all heard of the Myers-Briggs personality test? How many people have heard of Myers-Briggs before? Okay, a lot of people know Myers-Briggs. And how many people have actually done taken Myers-Briggs test? You have? Okay, so you'll know your little acronym. The Myers-Briggs personality test is a very common test that a lot of schools, businesses, counseling centers of different kinds, including career counselors, have people take this test to help give people insight into their personalities. And it's based on a combination of 16 different traits, and you have 8, right? 8 different traits, and they combine into different categories, a total of 16 possibilities. And anyway, so this test has been taken by many people, and the Anglican Church actually defined the different saints, a group of different Catholic saints, based on their Myers-Briggs personality test, and actually gave people the option, you can see, I'm an INFJ. What's my saint is Saint Catherine of Siena is my saint. And so you can find out what saint has similar characteristics to your own. But the interesting thing really is that they've come up with a category of personalities, a category for a whole bunch of different saints. This is this, whatever. And so you can see that, this is one thing that helps keep life interesting, even among the saints. It makes life interesting. It also gives us challenges to keep growing. And some of our traits that we may have may serve us well, while others might not. And sometimes our greatest strengths are actually also our greatest downfalls. For example, take somebody who's got a really great sense of humor, right? And that person makes so many people happy by joking all the time. It's a great, wonderful trait. It brings a lot of joy to people. But there are some times when joking and humor aren't really appropriate to a situation and actually can cause others discomfort. And so part of being able to function in the world is not just knowing ourselves, but also understanding how we can utilize our strengths in ways that are appropriate to particular situations. In other words, we need to be adaptable, and that is something that will come up a little bit later again. There's also a self-fulfilling aspect to our traits, in that if we regard ourselves as being a certain way, we're sure to reinforce it, and others may even reinforce it for us. And these characteristics then can become self-labels. For example, a person who is really shy, person regards herself as shy, she enters social situations with that self-perception and acts shy. And then other people may say, she's shy, and adjust their expectations of her accordingly. And that just reinforces the shyness. And that's what's called a self-fulfilling prophecy. Sorry, I'm a sociologist, so I can't help it. I can bring in the sociology periodically. Anyway, as a consequence of all this self-fulfilling prophecy, this person might become even more shy and not have the benefit of being able to be outgoing when that would be the most helpful approach in a particular situation. There also may be characteristics about ourselves that we don't even label. We might not even see them. We might be closed off to seeing them. For example, a person could be very generous, but have a tendency to always expect a lot in return for the generosity. So again, some things about ourselves, hopefully over time we become more insightful about what our traits are, what our tendencies are, but some we still might not see. We might need others to point them out to us. So why is this important? Why is it important to consider our traits and tendencies. Can we just be ourselves? Can't we just be however it is, if we're a shy person or whatever, just be ourselves? If we're a quiet person, why should we learn to speak up? And if we're naturally verbose and we just love to talk, why should we bother to try to learn to be quiet? As we're going to be discussing today, these different tendencies, especially when they become really solidified and habituated, may end up being impediments to our growth. And it's not just the characteristics themselves that can be a problem. It's also how we can end up narrowing ourselves by defining ourselves as our traits and habits. Our self-definitions usually go beyond the characteristics like gender and age and occupation to include what we might think of as being some of the key features of our personality and temperament. These characteristics can harden us and make us resistant to change and unable to adapt to changing situations in life. Whatever our personality characteristics and tendencies, we don't want to make the mistake of identifying with them and viewing them as being immutable. Similarly, we don't want to make the mistake of seeing other people's characteristics as being immutable and unchangeable, because then we might be keeping them from growing and developing. In a sense, we can call the efforts to address our individualities as being a form of character building. And Swami Vivekananda often expressed the importance of building character in his writing. A key aspect of building character is to overcome our negative tendencies and to continue to become stronger and stronger. Being tied to particular traits and habits keeps us from being able to adjust to different situations, and ultimately, this means that we become limited in our capacity to serve others. In other words, being tied to particular traits and habits keeps us tied to the ego. And that's a point that we'll also come back to later. In essence, how we deal with our personal characteristics is an important issue to address as we grow and move forward on our spiritual path. And we just don't want to end up being stuck on the path by being stuck on ourselves. So let's change gears a little bit and talk about perfection. We'll get to perfectionism a little bit later. Okay, so perfection. One of the, besides being a sociologist, I also do a lot of editing of other people's writing. And so when I think of the word perfection, perfection is what's called an absolute word, grammatically speaking. Something is either perfect or it's imperfect. Think about it, there's really no such thing as something that's slightly perfect, right? Or very perfect. There's no such thing as very perfect, right? There's no such thing as somewhat perfect. I mean, we say these things sometimes, right? But if you write it and you have an editor look at your manuscript, they'll say, no, you can't. It's either perfect or it's imperfect, right? So it's an absolute word. And there are a lot of other absolute words. For example, the word always and the word never are two other absolute words. And if you give your writing to an editor and they see the word, this always happens, this person always does this, no, it's like, that's not appropriate because it's an absolute word, okay? So we can put these words together though and say that the perfect is always perfect, right? Because they're both absolute words, perfect and always perfect, fine. Or the perfect is never imperfect. Right? So it's all absolute words together. And as I was thinking about this, it reminded me of the Vedic sloka that is often chanted here, which is translated as, this will be familiar to many of you, that is perfect, this too is perfect, the perfect comes out of the perfect. Taking the perfect from the perfect alone remains. Peace, peace, peace. And Swami Bhajananda clearly expressed the Vedantic view of perfection when he wrote the following in the early 1980s. And again, for me, in all my imperfections, it's not really within my grasp to really characterize perfection. So that's why I'm using the Swami's words here, because I think he explains it quite well. So what Swami Bhajananda said is that perfection must be sought in the right place. Perfection cannot be found in the external world, which is impermanent and full of contradictions. Freedom from limitations is the Vedantic criterion of perfection. Immutable truth, unity of existence, boundless bliss, this is all what is meant by perfection in Vedanta. There's only one thing which is free from all limitations of time, space, and causation. It is consciousness. It is in the depths of consciousness that perfection is to be sought. The present state of consciousness of ordinary people is no doubt limited, but these limitations are only products of ignorance. Again, this is still Swami Bhajananda. Through spiritual practice, ignorance can be removed and consciousness can be made to expand. By transforming and expanding his present consciousness, man can attain freedom from all limitations of time, space, and causation. Freedom from the dualities of good and evil, joy and sorrow, love and hate. It is this total freedom that is the Vedantic criterion of perfection. And the individual who has attained this freedom is the ideal of perfection. So, again, this is a very beautiful definition of perfection. It tells us its significance to us. Now, by contrast to this perfection, what is perfectionism? So we're going to talk a little bit about perfectionism as a personality trait, and it can be defined in a variety of ways. It can be defined simply as the need to be perfect, or a belief that perfection should be strived for. And as we've just discussed, perfection is an absolute word. In contrast, perfectionism is not an absolute word. And we could say that it's a relative word. And so individuals can be more or less perfectionistic. A person can be somewhat perfectionistic, very perfectionistic, or just slightly perfectionistic, or maybe not at all perfectionistic. There are different types of perfectionism. And maybe some of you, if you've taken a psychology class or done other sorts of studies related to this, psychologists go into a lot more detail than what I'm doing here, but I just wanted to give the sense that there are different types of perfectionism. And one of the basic divisions that psychologists make are between what are called adaptive perfectionists and maladaptive perfectionists. So there are some people who sometimes they're adaptive perfectionists in that they set high goals for themselves and they engage in positive achievement striving. But maladaptive perfectionism is related to setting unrealistically high goals and high levels of self-criticism and self-doubt. So this dichotomy that psychologists use between adaptive perfectionism and maladaptive perfectionism is helpful for seeing that perfectionism can take different forms. So not only is it relative that somebody might be more or less perfectionistic, it's also, there's this dichotomy between being perfectionistic in an adaptive way that might have some positive consequences, or in a maladaptive way that might have some negative consequences. And so defining what's adaptive and what's maladaptive, as you can imagine, is a little tricky. And psychologists have a personality test, the multidimensional perfectionistic scale. I don't know if anyone's ever taken it. You can also find it along with the different saints in the Myers-Briggs. You can also find the MPS, the multidimensional perfectionistic scale, on the web. And this tests, the results can be useful. You know, you can, if you take this test, you can get some insights into yourself, just like with the Myers-Briggs. But even with the test, you can imagine that in day-to-day life, someone who has perfection, is always striving for perfection and believe that everything should be perfect, a person who's always striving for that, sometimes that effort might be very adaptive and have positive consequences, and other times it might be very maladaptive. So it really depends on the particular context. And so there's been a lot of psychological research on perfectionism, how to measure it, and what its positive and negative consequences might be. But again, for today, we'll just stick with these basic, simple definitions. Again, we can imagine that perfectionism can have positive or negative consequences, both for the individual, him or herself, and also with the people with whom the person interacts. So, why are we considering today perfectionism and not some other individual trait, such as, there are all sorts of traits. A person who might have a tendency towards being narcissistic, person might have a tendency to exaggerate, person might be self-deprecating, a person might be lazy, have any of these different traits. And why are we choosing perfectionism? Besides the fact that it sounds nice as a title, which is really great too. So maybe that's one reason, but that's not really the reason. It does sound nice as a title, but we could choose any trait, really, and have the same talk. But the reason that I chose perfectionism is that perfectionism and religion are often seen to go together. For example, most, if all not all religions, have some sort of a behavioral code that adherents are expected to follow, which requires attention to doing things correctly. As mentioned earlier, perfectionism itself is defined as the belief that perfection should be strived for. So we can imagine that people who aspire to embody religious ideals would strive to achieve them perfectly and not haphazardly. And researchers indeed have found that people who are religious seekers are more likely to be perfectionists than the general population. And whether it's perfectionists are attracted to religion or religion makes people more perfectionistic, I don't know, that's perhaps yet to be seen, but they are at least correlated. It's also interesting that there was actually a religion called perfectionism. Anybody ever hear of it? Perfectionism? There was a religious leader in the 1800s called John Humphrey Noyes, who believed that he had a reactionary doctrine that was opposed to Calvinism, and that in contrast to Calvinism, the perfectionists believed that it was possible for an individual to be free of sin through conversion and willpower. And the leader, John Humphrey Noyes, declared himself to be perfect. And of course, this created a lot of controversy in the 1800s, as did his group called the Oneida Community, which was a utopian community in the 1800s in upstate New York. If you ever have Oneida silverware, is anybody familiar with that? Okay, so that has a connection to perfectionism in that this utopian community of perfectionists first produced the Oneida silverware and then eventually got bought out. But anyway, so the idea is, and I have, there's all this, it's great to have a lot of information in your mind that's not often useful, but occasionally it connects to other things. The whole point of this is that perfectionism and religion are likely to have some kind of connection. But at the same time, so whatever our traits are, it's good to be flexible and adaptable depending on whatever the situation is. And again, as I mentioned, perfectionism can either be adaptive or maladaptive depending on the context. Paying very close attention to detail, which we might associate with perfectionism, can be a positive trait. For one, paying attention to detail is a way to train the mind to become more focused and attentive. A lot of the practices, we hear a lot about the practices of mindfulness now, and those practices are associated with learning to focus the mind and keep it on the object of attention. And Sri Ramakrishna himself is reported to have taken much care with his personal items and his environment. For example, Swami Chaitananda wrote in his book, Sri Ramakrishna as We Saw Him. He said, Sri Ramakrishna kept everything in his room in perfect order. Every object had its proper place so that even in the dark, he could find what he wanted. An orderly mind is as necessary as external order. So many people take the view, actually, that internal order, like order of the mind, and external order of the environment actually go together. And I don't know if anyone has actually done an experimental study about the differences between meditating in a really clean room, an orderly room, and a really, really messy room. But, if somebody is really advanced in their meditation, probably it makes absolutely no difference. But for most of us, keeping one's space clean and in order can help the mind stay in order as well, at least in part because there are fewer distractions. And again, researchers have found that just in general, keeping an orderly environment helps people to reduce stress and make better choices and, be more relaxed and not as stressed out. But on the flip side, if paying attention to detail means that a person has become obsessed about detail, for example, being so obsessed about order and cleanliness to the point of not being able to engage in any other action, or to the point that perfection is demanded from other people, then it can be maladaptive. So depending on the context, paying acute attention to detail may be appropriate, or it may be unnecessary and simply take up time and energy. For example, it's worthwhile to, while sweeping the floor, if you're sweeping the floor, to sweep it as perfectly as you can. But while you're doing this, dust and dirt are starting to reappear immediately, even before you've completed sweeping the floor. And so a floor is never going to be perfectly clean. Should we give up sweeping the floor? No, because there's value in perfecting the action of sweeping itself. And in the relative world, there's value to making an effort to have a relatively clean floor. But what can happen is we can confuse outer perfection with inner perfection. And the focus on outer appearances of perfection can be problematic. One could start chasing after these seemingly perfect imperfections and unnecessarily get caught up in all sorts of drama, as inevitably happens when we chase after anything. By definition, anything of the material plane is imperfect. So seeking perfection in the world, relative world, is a folly. Still, at the same time, our effort is important. Our effort to pay attention to our actions and not be attached to the results is an expression of our sincerity and our desire to know true perfection. So we shouldn't give up on sweeping even if the floor is just getting dirty again. At the same time, each of us should be alert and adaptive to circumstances. Even if we don't have anger, for example, or maybe we're actually trying to work on anger, so we have anger, but we're trying to work on not being so angry, it can be important to actually have the capacity to act angry if needed, because it might be needed. There are some situations in which acting angry is the needed response. And Sri Ramakrishna well conveyed this in the parable, and it's a parable that I know many of you probably know. It's in the first chapter of the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna. And it's a little bit of a kind of long story, but it's worth telling because it reminds us of the importance of being adaptive to circumstances. And it's called The Snake Who Wouldn't Hiss. I don't know if you know this story. Okay, so if you don't know it, it's Cute story, good story. So here it is. Some cowherd boys used to tend their cows in a meadow where a terrible poisonous snake lived, and everyone was on the alert for the fear of it. One day, a brahmachari was going along the meadow. The boys ran to him and said, "Revered sir, don't go that way. A venomous snake lives over there." "What of it, my good children?" said the brahmachari. "I'm not afraid of the snake. I know some mantras." So saying, he continued on his way to the meadow. In the meantime, the snake moved swiftly toward him with upraised hood. As soon as it came near, the brahmachari recited a mantra, and the snake lay at his feet like an earthworm. The brahmachari said, "Look here, why do you go about doing harm? Come, I will give you a holy word. By repeating it, you will learn to love God. Ultimately, you'll realize him and get rid of your violent nature." Saying this, he taught the snake a holy word and initiated him into spiritual life. And the snake bowed before the teacher and said, "Revered sir, how shall I practice spiritual discipline?" "Repeat that sacred word," said the teacher, "and do no harm to anybody." Some days passed, and the cowherd boys noticed that the snake would not bite. They threw stones at it. Still, the snake showed no anger. It behaved as if it were an earthworm. And one day, one of the boys came up to it, caught it by its tail, and whirled it around and dashed it on the ground, threw it away. The snake became unconscious. It was stunned. It couldn't move. So thinking it was dead, the boys went their way. Late at night, the snake regained consciousness. Slowly and with great difficulty, it dragged himself into its hole. Its bones were broken and it could scarcely move. Many days passed. The snake became a mere skeleton covered with skin. Now and then at night, it would come out looking for food. But for fear of the boys, it wouldn't leave its hole during the daytime because it was afraid of the boys. Since receiving the sacred word from his teacher, it had given up doing harm to others. It maintained its life on dirt, leaves, and on the fruit that fell from trees. About a year later, the brahmachari came that way again and asked after the snake. The cowherd boys told him it was dead. But the brahmachari couldn't believe him. He found the place where he thought the snake was and searched here and there, calling it by name. And hearing the teacher's voice, the snake came out of its hole and bowed before him with great reverence. "How are you?" the teacher said. "I am well, sir," said the snake. But the teacher asked, "Why are you so thin?" The snake replied, "Revered sir, you ordered me not to hurt anybody. So I've only been living on leaves and some fruit. Maybe that's made me thinner." The snake had developed the quality of sattva. It could not be angry with anybody. It had totally forgotten that the cowherd boys had almost killed it. The brahmachari said, "It can't be mere want of food that has reduced you to this state. There must be some other reason. Think a little." And then the snake remembered the boys had dashed him to the ground and almost killed him. And he told the brahmachari, he said, "Well, okay, yeah, I remember. The boys one day dashed me to the ground and I forgot. They're ignorant, after all. They didn't realize what a great change had come over my mind, and how could they possibly know that I wouldn't hurt anybody?" And then the brahmachari exclaimed, "What a shame. You're such a fool. You don't even know how to protect yourself. I asked you not to bite, but I didn't forbid you to hiss. Why didn't you scare them by hissing?" And so this is often called the parable of the snake who was afraid to hiss. And Sri Ramakrishna told this story because people's behavior sometimes are contingent on circumstances. And there's one very unexpected person who actually really did hiss. And this provides an excellent example of adapting one's temperament to what is best and most appropriate in a situation. And this is an occurrence in the life of Sri Sarada Devi. One time she was sitting for meditation when she could hear a scuffle. Obviously, her mind was taken out of meditation. She could hear a scuffle outside her window where a man was beating his wife. And he was slapping and kicking her and pushing her, even though she was holding her child. Now, Holy Mother, as you can imagine, had a very quiet, meek-sounding voice, usually. But all of a sudden when she got up, she went, and I'm not going to yell in the microphone, but she got up and went to the window, and she yelled out the window at the people, the guy that was out there. And she yelled, "You rogue, are you going to kill this girl outright? I'm afraid she's already dead." She really yelled it, though. And so with this reprimand, the man released the woman and burst out into tears and became quiet and sought to be at peace with his wife. Now, it's hard to imagine Holy Mother hissing and so loudly, yet her action reflected what was compassionate in that particular situation. And so acting angry sometimes might actually be an unselfish response. And there might be situations in which acting angry is not really what we want to do. And others may criticize us for it too. But it could be an appropriate response. If we act angry, but we don't feel angry, it's hissing. So what are some helpful ways that we can work on ourselves so that we can become less attached to our traits, become more flexible and adaptable to certain situations, and eventually reveal our true perfection? One key way to do this is to pay attention to the people and the circumstances around us, which are always teaching us if we're open to receiving that teaching. And Sri Ramakrishna, again, is a great exemplar, actually a truly perfect exemplar of a teacher who guided his students in whatever way they needed to learn. He is highly attuned to the difference among people, especially the difference among his devotees, and the need to help people balance out their individual tendencies. In his unique and enlightened way, he guided them as individuals. And in his book, Sri Ramakrishna, as we saw him, Swami Chidananda shares this anecdote, and also many of you have heard this story too, about how Swami Yogananda was overhearing several men criticizing Sri Ramakrishna, and he just didn't do anything, and he reported the incident to Sri Ramakrishna. He didn't do anything. He heard people saying bad things about him, didn't do anything. And Sri Ramakrishna said, why did you keep quiet? People are abusing me. Why didn't you say something? And then on another occasion, a different devotee, Swami Niranjananda, was on his way to a place by boat. And there too, several people were criticizing Sri Ramakrishna. And Swami Niranjananda had a completely different temperament from Swami Yogananda, and right? And he started yelling at the people in the boat when they were saying mean things. He was saying, "You're abusing him. I'm going to sink this boat. I'd like to see who dares stop me." And they were all frightened, and of course word got back to Sri Ramakrishna about this, and he said, "You fool! They abused me, so what is it to you? Let people say what they like. What does it matter to you?" Right? So he's giving two completely different responses, right, to two different people. It's like, what? That could be very maybe confusing to outsiders, but clearly he didn't have any personal investment at all in what other people were saying about him. He was using this as a teachable moment for his students. His teaching was for their benefit, not for his own benefit. So what about us? How are we guided to address our own tendencies, whether it's perfectionism or something else? Maybe we have the benefit of people who criticize us directly. And this is where, if we have people who criticize us, this is where we have an opportunity to view other people as our teachers. It's one way to see divine consciousness working through other individuals. And it can be very helpful to pay attention to the criticisms of others. But when others criticize us, we don't actually know what their motives are. The criticisms may be founded or they may be unfounded. So we don't need to believe the criticisms necessarily. We can use them as a basis for self-reflection. It gives us also an opportunity to practice tolerance, to evaluate the extent of our egoistic attachments to our actions, and to keep our defenses in check. Perhaps for those with perfectionist tendencies, those who are aiming to be perfect in their actions, criticism has a special utility in that it reminds us that we're human beings who have not yet realized our perfection. And all of our actions, however well-intended, have a mixture of positive and negative consequences. So some people will praise us, others will blame us, and criticisms help ensure that we don't get attached to the praise and that we don't start using good actions as a way to puff up our ego. At the same time, this isn't a license to criticize other people. As Holy Mother suggested, we should be focused on finding our own faults. And probably there's already enough judgment and criticism in this world. But whatever criticisms we do receive, it gives us an opportunity to review our own behaviors. In addition to criticism, it seems as though life itself brings us the problems and obstacles that, if we're open to addressing them, provide us with the training we need to help us become more malleable and help us balance ourselves out in whatever way we need. And in this sense, life itself scolds us. We can call this grace, actually. As Swami Vivekananda is often quoted as saying, "In a day when you don't come across any problems, you can be sure that you are traveling in a wrong path." You guys heard this before? I don't know, it periodically shows up. On Facebook, there are all these wonderful groups that post quotes from different people. And this one, I don't know, maybe it's a message to me. Personally, but if I'm on Facebook, for some reason, I see this very frequently. Again, in a day when you don't come across any problems, you can be sure that you are traveling in a wrong path. It sounds really kind of ironic, actually. And many have remarked, if you talk to people who've been on a spiritual path for a long time, that many people tell you, well, actually, as they became more and more committed to a spiritual path, they actually started having more problems. Right? No, maybe they didn't seem as problematic because they had adjusted their mindset accordingly, but the problems in life don't stop, even if you're, whatever you do. So this also we can use as part of our learning. But ongoing self-examination is really the key. As we work on ourselves, we need to keep our intention in mind. Are we engaging in actions to enhance how we appear to other people? Are we trying to boost our ego by engaging in good actions and trying to appear perfect? Or are we doing our best just for its own sake? As Swami Vivekananda often pointed out, whatever our goals, we need to pay more attention to the means by which we're seeking to achieve them. If our intention is the realization of perfection, then our efforts should be directed toward that. And one of the key steps of following along this path is to purify the mind and to find our own faults. It can be very helpful to take a few minutes at the end of every day to examine ourselves. And I've heard Swami Tyagananda of the Boston Center discuss this helpful practice. At the end of the day, we can look at the criticism that we've maybe received from other people and learn from it and reflect on how we can best address life's problems. We can examine our own intentions and make efforts to be honest with ourselves about the extent to which our choices are ego-enhancing or intended to bring benefits to others. One helpful check is to see how we respond when our actions don't have our intended effect. Are we upset when our actions don't receive the reactions that we want? When we work hard on a project, for example, and receive criticism instead of praise, does that make us feel bad or feel angry? So it's good to take this time for self-examination. But at the same time, when examining ourselves, it really needs to be done in a spirit of renunciation and compassion. We need to be as kind to ourselves as we would be to other people when we examine ourselves. So to tie all these ideas together, we can reflect for just a moment on some words from Sister Devamata. And she was a Westerner who had met Swami Vivekananda in the late 1800s, and she was a key figure in the Vedanta movement in the United States. She wrote a lot. I mean, she was a teacher, and she also wrote some wonderful essays and books. And she had published this article in 1921 on virtue and spiritual growth. And it's beautifully written. I did my best to abbreviate some of the key points just so that you can hear her words, even with our short amount of time here. So this is what she wrote. We can measure our spiritual growth and our spiritual sincerity by how far we seek higher things for their own sake. True culture penetrates to the minutest habits of life. There should be no veneer or contradiction anywhere. Virtues form a part of our social code, but they are not embedded in our character. We concern ourselves too much with the practice of isolated virtues. We make too little effort to rise to the realm of virtue. We must look upon life not in relation to what is lovable or unlovable, but in relation to love itself. Work for work's sake, love for love's sake, truth for truth's sake, life for life's sake. This must be our standard. Spirituality means cleaning out the dross and refining every part of our being until no adulteration remains. That is what purity means. So it's a very, again, beautiful article published in 1921 by Sister Devamata in a journal called Vedanta Monthly at that time. Whatever our impediments, we should recognize that ultimately they're transient and part of being a human being in a relative world. Keeping our thoughts directed toward perfection and higher ideals, we also have ample opportunities to discover our weaknesses and make efforts to refine our human personalities. Being with others who have similar higher goals, sitting in environments that evoke purity, and purifying the mind with one's mantra or a holy word of one's choice. These are all means of cleaning out the dross of our human beingness. So we're really all in this together. As much as we may seem all very different in our traits and habits, we all have obstacles to overcome. And we're all in this journey toward oneness. At our essence, we are all perfect. And so may we be guided to focus on the higher ideals and to have the experiences that we need to overcome the obstacles that stand in the way of our realizing perfection. Thank you very much. Om Shanti. Thank you.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, Q&A. Oh, right. Right. I used to live, I lived in Providence for quite a while, and but I've been away for 3.5 years, and I know this is a sort of a new thing. I'm happy to answer any questions that anybody has, or comments, feedback, reflections, anything. I don't want to pick on anybody. Yes, hi, Shrikant.
You said perfection is absolute, but people's view of perfection is relative and they lead to conflicts. And especially if you have this maladaptive perfectionism,
come out of what? How to come out of perfectionism and find perfection?
Right, because the views of perfection are not, I mean,
Not possible.
right.
Perfection is not associated really with the physical plane. You know, so, you know, someone who has really attained a very high state of spiritual maturity can probably appropriate that. I mean, and actually that's why I chose the Swami's, to quote from the Swami's word of perfection, because I feel like that's not something that you can really easily put into words. You know, so following the teachings that I understand, that, you know, gradually refining oneself to whatever extent we're able to, with the guidance of others and the inspiration of others. You know, that's what I see, and all spiritual, you know, all the spiritual disciplines to make efforts towards that. Anyone else have comment? Yes, hi.
Which Swami did you say it was that said, well, if you have a day without problems, it's not, you don't have to get happy?
Yeah, that's Swami Vivekananda.
The one who's quoted up there?
Yes, exactly. Yes, yes. And so, as a really the key student of Sri Ramakrishna, he's the person who brought a lot of the ideas to Vedanta to the West. So I suggest check him out. There's so much been written by him and about him, but it's a great quote. And actually, if anybody happens to know where the quote is actually from, please let me know, because I just see the quote standing out in different places, but I've never actually, no one cites it, so, I'd love to be able to have a citation for where that appears in all his writings. Anybody else? Well, thank you again, and thank you to Swami Yogamanandaji, who's away in Chicago right now, I believe, for asking me to come here. A great thing about giving a talk is that it compels you to sit down and try to work out some ideas yourself, and others, my friends here who've also done talks know, it's a real challenge because you have, you have to really bring your mind to the topic and focus your mind on that topic for some time. So it's been a really great pleasure for me to have this opportunity. And thank you again.